Welcome back to another deep dive. Before we even get into it today, I want to look right at you and say, please hit that like button and subscribe to the show.
Yes, definitely do that.
It really helps us out, and you are absolutely going to want to be subscribed for what we are unpacking today. Today's deep dive is an exclusive, ultra-long, and I mean really incisive review of a deeply provocative 2025 ebook. It's making serious waves.
Oh, massive waves.
Yeah, it's called Desert Wandering, Reincarnation, Bardo, and Building a House Again, and it's by Conrad Riker.
And it is a dense, incredibly layered document. We have a huge amount of ground to cover today.
We really do. And I want to give you a heads up right out of the gate. If this deep dive hooks you, and I promise it will, you can go buy this ebook right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Highly recommend checking the source material yourself.
Exactly. You should also make sure to follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack to see where his research goes next. Now, to set the stage for you, this book is written explicitly as a red-pilled blueprint.
Right. The target audience here is very specifically the men's rights activist community and men in the manosphere.
Yeah, the core mission of Riker's text is to explore the history of human institutions and argue that they were functionally superior before being, in his exact words, captured by feminists and Marxists.
Which brings us to a crucial piece of framing before we actually step into the text itself.
That is a very, very important point. I need to explicitly state to you, our listener, that this deep dive is going to explore these highly polarized, politically charged ideas completely impartially. We are not taking sides here. We are not endorsing the viewpoints found in this book. Our job today is strictly to unpack these fascinating arguments and synthesize the author's worldview exactly as it's written on the page.
We're looking at this text like intellectual anthropologists, really, trying to understand a specific cultural architecture. That anthropological distance is the best way to approach it. The value for you, the listener, is in understanding the mechanics of the argument, the historical correlations Riker attempts to make, and the philosophy driving this movement, regardless of where anyone personally stands on the political spectrum.
Okay, let's unpack this. Conrad Riker builds his entire philosophy on a concept he calls the desert of modernity. He argues that modern society is essentially a desert of lies, an environment specifically designed to drain masculine strength by labeling it as toxic.
He essentially posits that men today are caught in a brutal psychological trap that they just cannot negotiate their way out of.
And what does he call that trap?
He identifies it as the vulnerability double bind. Riker argues that modern culture, particularly within corporate structures and mainstream media, constantly demands that men open up, that they show emotional vulnerability.
But he says it's a trap.
Right. He claims it is a rigged game. His premise relies on the idea that if a man actually shows weakness, he is secretly despised by the very people asking for it. Conversely, if he displays traditional stoic strength, he is publicly demonized. Riker views it as a completely unwinnable scenario.
The juxtaposition he uses to illustrate this is really striking. He brings up the actor Jason Momoa.
Oh, the Aquaman example.
Yeah. Riker points out that when Momoa is playing Aquaman, snapping submarines like twigs and being a physical powerhouse, the public cheers. But the moment Momoa does an interview and tears up talking about his children, the trap snaps shut.
GQ magazine might call it refreshing vulnerability.
Right, but internet trolls immediately sneer and label him a beta.
Riker doesn't just leave it at pop culture, though. He brings this right into the corporate boardroom to show the material consequences of this double bind. He cites the case of former Boeing CEO Dennis Muhlenberg,
who allegedly faced career suicide after tearing up at a press conference during a crisis.
Exactly. And to back this up, Riker points to CDC data claiming that men face an 83% demotion risk for showing vulnerability at work. The argument he is making is that the biological reality of the market ruthlessly punishes what the HR department claims to encourage.
So what is the prescription then for the men reading this? If the game is rigged, how does Riker suggest they play it?
He writes that men must stop negotiating with modern culture entirely. Stop apologizing, stop attending the dialogue sessions.
Become granite.
Yes, she tells his readers they have to become granite.
I want you, the listener, to consider that tension for a second. Think about how often you see this dynamic play out in the modern workplace, where corporate messaging demands emotional openness, but the underlying market metrics seemingly only reward flawless execution and absolute stoicism. Riker is essentially telling his audience to throw out the HR manuals and embrace the granite.
And becoming granite is just the entry point into a much larger, more complex framework. because Riker takes this sociocultural grievance and suddenly elevates it to a cosmic theological level.
This is where the book gets wild.
It does. He introduces a theoretical model that merges theology with quantum theory, specifically leaning heavily on Chris Langan's CTMU.
The cognitive theoretic model of the universe. I have to pause you there because the book gets incredibly dense in this chapter. What exactly is the CTMU, and how does Riker translate that into a blueprint for masculinity? Is he saying the universe literally thinks like a man?
It is a heavy concept. Simply put, CTMU suggests that reality is a self-processing language. It's a universe that configures itself through logic. What's fascinating here is how Riker adapts this.
How so?
He takes that concept of reality as a self-configuring language and explicitly equates it to masculine syntax. He views men not just as the builders of society, but as the universe's original programmers.
He goes all the way back to the Book of Genesis to make this point.
Yes. When Adam is naming the beasts in the Garden of Eden, Riker argues this wasn't just a guy discovering animals. He calls it cosmic legislation. In Riker's view, it was male cognition physically imposing order on the chaos of reality.
And he frames all modern male achievements through this exact lens of dominion, doesn't he?
He does.
Like when Elon Musk fires rockets to Mars, Riker argues that isn't hubris or billionaire ego. He describes it as Genesis chapter 1, verse 28.
The biblical command to subdue the earth.
Exactly, subdue the earth wrapped in carbon fiber.
And he attempts to back this up with some very specific metrics. Riker notes that 97% of all patents are held by men, framing this not as a sociological outcome, but as evidence of this cosmic legislation at work.
He even brings math into it.
Yeah, he argues that male dominance is geometrically written into the fabric of nature itself. He points to Fibonacci spirals and the golden ratio as the mathematical foundation shaping the ideal male face and physical structure.
Which brings in a very ancient, almost mythological layer to the book. He relies heavily on Manichaeism. To translate that for the audience, Manichaeism is an ancient religion based on a stark, almost comic book style dualism. It's a literal, unyielding war between absolute light and absolute dark.
That dualism is the engine of his entire philosophy. Riker cites St. Augustine's early Manichaean phase to set this up. In Riker's framework, traditional biological masculinity is the order-bringing force. It represents the light.
And the dark.
Conversely, he frames gender fluidity, modern feminism, and emotional vulnerability as a satanic sabotage. To him, those elements represent chaos and darkness, actively trying to dismantle the light.
With that cosmic war established, Riker pivots to a brutal critique of modern institutions. His core thesis here is that whenever a society ignores this hard biological realism in favor of what he calls cultural Marxism, the entire system inevitably collapses.
And he pulls some jaw-dropping historical case studies to try and prove this pattern.
The historical sweep he attempts is quite broad. It starts with the Soviet Union in the 1920s. According to the text, the early Soviets attempted a radical gender experiment.
Right, forcing women into heavy mining and factory labor while collectivizing childcare to eliminate the traditional family structure.
The numbers he attaches to that experiment are staggering. He claims this ideological shift resulted in a 40% drop in industrial productivity and left 13 million orphans scavenging in train yards.
He uses that massive systemic failure to argue that Stalin eventually had to reverse the policy in the 1930s, not out of traditionalism, but because the literal machinery of the state was breaking down.
And then he contrasts that Soviet failure with Henry Ford in 1914.
Yes. Riker points out that Ford made the unprecedented decision to pay his male workers $5 a day, which was double the industry standard at the time.
So if the Soviet experiment is his example of a collapse, how does Henry Ford fit into his model of success? Why did paying men more solve the problem in Riker's eyes?
Riker writes that Ford's decision wasn't charity. It was a calculated strategy. Ford did it specifically so the men could support their families on a single income.
Reinforcing the provider role.
Exactly. By reinforcing the man's natural role as a provider and aligning corporate policy with biological hierarchy, Riker claims productivity on the assembly line exploded by 47% in just 18 months. He views this as absolute proof that honoring traditional masculine roles yields tangible, physical results.
From there, the book transitions into modern progressive policies, specifically targeting Sweden. He looks at their experiment with gender-neutral preschools, where educators actively try to dismantle gender norms in toddlers.
Riker cites studies claiming that after these feminist policies were implemented, The suicide rates for boys tripled, and young boys experienced massive spikes in panic attacks.
He argues that trying to engineer equality in a way that defies biological reality literally fractures the human psyche.
And he brings that same critique to contemporary infrastructure. The examples he uses to highlight this institutional sabotage are incredibly vivid. He details a story about a UK facilities manager who supposedly wept from the stress of having to install $2,500 all-gender toilets to replace highly functional urinals.
Meanwhile, the female janitors in the same building were filing physical injury claims.
Right, because they had to haul heavy menstrual bins out of unisex stalls. Riker frames this as a ritualistic, expensive dismantling of male efficiency that ends up hurting everyone involved.
The contrast he draws in San Francisco is even sharper. He looks at the sinking Millennium Tower. According to Riker, while the luxury tower was actively tilting and sinking into the mud, the female engineers proposed holding dialogue sessions to discuss the problem.
And while those dialogue sessions were allegedly happening, a male crew, led by an engineer named John Fisher, simply went to work. Riker notes they drilled 18 concrete anchors deep into the bedrock in 72 hours to physically stabilize the structure.
Riker uses this specific juxtaposition to declare that patriarchy isn't a social construct. He says it is civilization's load-bearing wall.
He makes some pretty intense claims about physical biology to back this up too.
What kind of physiological metrics is he looking at to prove that men are these load-bearing walls?
The stats in this section are relentless. He points to osteological data claiming male leg bones have 30% thicker cortical density, making them literal shock absorbers for the physical labor of civilization.
Wow.
Yeah, and he correlates that with occupational hazard data, pointing out that 92% of all workplace deaths are men. And he brings up the 33 Chilean miners who were trapped half a mile underground in 2010.
That anecdote is wild to read in this context.
It is. Riker points out they were all men, locked in an unimaginably stressful situation. Yet when they were rescued, they didn't demand trauma therapists. He notes that they survived the ordeal by relying on strict hierarchy and singing their national anthem together like Spartan hoplites returning from battle.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because Riker doesn't just want men to survive these ordeals, he wants them to actively seek them out to be forged. This leads us into the survivalist, almost mystical section of the book.
He borrows a concept from Tibetan Buddhism called the Bardo.
Right, which is the transitional state between death and rebirth. He applies this to masculine readiness, calling it Bardo boot camp.
He argues that men need to rehearse their own death daily, to treat mortality as their toughest instructor, so that the fear of modern trivial things dissolves completely.
And he backs this philosophy up with a deeply extreme personal anecdote. After going through a brutal startup bankruptcy in New York, a failure that cost his investors heavily and ruined his reputation, Riker didn't retreat into therapy or corporate rehab.
No, he went to Greenland during the dark season.
Riker writes that he spent 3 weeks completely alone in a snow cave at negative 60 degrees Celsius. He had no tent, just the ice. He describes experiencing this glacial timescale, completely removed from the digital world.
He claims that facing this genuine lethal peril physically thickened his prefrontal cortex and completely rewired his brain's response to stress.
He connects this Greenland isolation to a concept he calls sovereignty circuits.
To explain this, he references military research on Norwegian Special Forces winter training, detailing what neurologists call cold shock neuroadaptation. He gives this incredible example of a frostbitten commando who was able to accurately guess his own dropping core temperature at 34.2 degrees Celsius without any medical instruments.
Using just pure interoception.
Yes, the brain's ability to perceive the body's internal state. Riker uses that to argue that modern corporate survival retreats where executives go glamping with satellite phones are entirely useless.
He states that men must seek out genuine, unmitigated peril to activate these dormant Pleistocene survival genetics. He is basically saying the comfort of the modern world is a poison, and the only cure is raw, unfiltered danger.
And this physical mastery ties directly into how a man experiences time. Riker introduces this concept of kairotic moments, or kairos. These are divine hinge points in time where the ordinary rules of reality suspend and immediate decisive action is required.
His prime example for this is Winston Churchill in May of 1940, isn't it? Parliament is demanding surrender negotiations with Hitler. The pressure is unimaginable.
Exactly. Riker paints this vivid picture of Churchill. His dentures hurting, tasting the whiskey sour on his tongue, realizing the absolute gravity of the moment, and growling, "We shall fight on the beaches."
What a moment to isolate.
He points out that the speech itself took 17 minutes, but the preparation to be the kind of man who could deliver it took 51 years. The rule of Kairos, according to Riker, is that you must act before conscious thought even catches up. You have to dominate time, not just manage it.
Act before thought catches up. That is a powerful phrasing for his audience.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Riker ties all of this physical hardship and temporal dominance back to a concept he calls bloodline batteries. He cites modern epigenetic research, which shows that trauma and resilience can leave chemical markers on our genes.
He argues that this strength echoes down through mitochondrial DNA, and that your lineage is a live wire humming with ancestral energy.
Now, wait a second. Mitochondrial DNA, doesn't that come exclusively from the mother?
That is a fascinating biological irony in a book so fiercely dedicated to patriarchal inheritance and male dominion. Riker uses the term broadly to mean the energy of forefathers and male ancestors. But scientifically speaking, mitochondrial DNA is passed down the maternal line.
That is a brilliant catch, and it really highlights the value of analyzing this text objectively. Even with that biological contradiction, how does he want his readers to use this bloodline battery?
He uses it to explain the famous Navy SEAL 40% rule.
The idea that when your brain screams that you are completely done and cannot take another step, you have actually only tapped into 40% of your physical capacity.
Right. Riker says you push past that final 60% by tapping into the bloodline battery. He argues that when things get unimaginably hard, you aren't fighting alone. You have the ghosts of your ancestors fueling you. It's a total rejection of the modern therapeutic model.
He says that men shouldn't be sitting in circles unpacking their trauma. They should be harvesting the energy of their ancestors' struggles to build empires and outlast the chaos.
We have covered a massive amount of ideological ground here. Let's try to summarize the core mission of Conrad Riker's Desert Wondering. Ultimately, this book is a radical, unapologetic call to arms for his specific audience in the manosphere.
He wants men to build psychological armor.
He wants them to fortify their boundaries. He literally uses the biblical example of Nehemiah rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem with a trowel in one hand to build and a sword in the other hand to defend. He is demanding that men reclaim their sovereignty against what he views as the parasitic decay of modern culture.
It is an operating system for a very specific type of cultural resistance. It demands that biology, hierarchy, and physical strength be recognized not as fluid social constructs to be dismantled, but as the fundamental divine syntax of reality itself.
So what does this all mean? We've unpacked the history, the quantum theory, the Greenland ice caves, and the biological arguments. Where do we land with all of this as observers?
This raises an important question, one that builds on Riker's text but forces us to look beyond it. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Riker's fundamental premise is correct.
Okay.
That the universe inherently rewards strict physical masculine dominion, biological hierarchy, and physical order. What happens to human evolution as we transition into a purely digital, AI-driven future?
Oh, that is a fascinating pivot, because his entire argument is based on lifting steel, building physical walls, and surviving the freezing cold.
Precisely. When the physical constraints of reality, the actual desert itself, become entirely virtual. When algorithms and artificial intelligence manage the chaos instead of calloused hands and thicker cortical bone density, does this ancient biological programming that Riker so fiercely defends become totally obsolete?
Or does the battleground simply change its shape?
Exactly, requiring a new kind of digital dominion. It's a question of whether his perennial man can survive in a world where physical reality is no longer the primary hurdle of civilization.
That is a phenomenal thought to leave on. If the physical world is conquered by code, what happens to the hardware of the human male? I want you, the listener, to chew on that today. And listen, if this deep dive sparked your curiosity, if you want to read these arguments directly from the source and understand this movement, you need to go buy the ebook Desert Wondering by Conrad Riker.
It is available right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
You should also absolutely go follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack to see where he takes these ideas next.
It is certainly a text that provokes a reaction and demands a close reading.
Thank you so much for joining us for this ultra-long, incisive review. Do not forget to hit like and subscribe to the deep dive so you never miss out when we unpack the most provocative sources out there. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will see you next time.